China has responded immediately to the new U.S. tariffs, announcing retaliatory measures against U.S. food imports.
China has retaliated after Donald Trump imposed new tariffs on its exports. The country's finance minister announced new levies.
The trade war between the US and China has just escalated to a whole new level. And this time, Beijing isn't just fighting back. It's going for the jugular. After the US slapped a 10% blanket tariff on all Chinese imports, raising the total to nearly 30%, China wasted no time retaliating. But they didn't just impose counter-tariffs. They launched a long-planned strategy designed to hit America where it hurts most. Beyond targeting key US industries, China is securing control over vital global supply chains, tightening its grip on rare resources, and striking deals with US rivals to weaken America's global economic power. This isn't just a trade dispute anymore. It's a battle for economic dominance. So what exactly is China doing? How will it reshape the world economy? And why are US industries more vulnerable than ever? Let's break it all down. The US-China trade war escalates, what it means for the global economy. Beijing has responded forcefully to the latest wave of US tariffs, launching a series of retaliatory taxes aimed directly at American goods. This move follows the sweeping 10% tariff introduced by former President Donald Trump, which applied to all Chinese imports entering the United States. With these new measures stacked on top of existing tariffs, the total duties on many Chinese products have now climbed to approximately 30%. Trump's strategy focuses on one clear target: China's massive trade surplus. In the past year alone, China exported $1 trillion more in goods and services than it imported. The trade deficit between the US and China has remained a major point of contention, with Trump frequently emphasizing the staggering imbalance. He has long argued that China is using the profits gained from this trade surplus to strengthen its military and expand its geopolitical influence. When the US imposed its latest round of tariffs on Chinese imports in February 2025, the intended effect seemed obvious. Washington expected that the economic strain would force China to adjust its trade policies, conceding to US demands. However, that is not what happened. China's calculated response, a long-term strategy. Rather than yielding to economic pressure, China struck back with a meticulously planned strategy years in the making. While Beijing did introduce tariffs targeting specific American products, its response went far deeper than simple retaliation. China has moved aggressively to secure vital supply chains, tighten its grip on rare resources, and form strategic partnerships with US rivals. This is not just about responding to trade restrictions. It is about reshaping the global economic balance of power. By countering US pressure with calculated economic maneuvers, Beijing is positioning itself to reduce reliance on American markets while simultaneously weakening America's global leverage. The latest tariffs imposed by the US are part of a broader effort to revive American manufacturing. The administration introduced sweeping restrictions on over $60 billion worth of Chinese goods, focusing on key industries. The targeted products include computer components, electric vehicle materials, and other essential resources needed for modern technology. Trump framed these actions as necessary to protect American jobs and encourage domestic production. However, from China's perspective, the tariffs represent something much larger, an attempt to curb its economic influence and slow its rise as a global power. Rather than reacting impulsively, China responded with precision. Within days, Beijing announced tariffs on $35 billion worth of American products, strategically targeting industries vital to the US economy. China's counterattack: more than just tariffs. China's retaliation did not solely focus on raising taxes on American imports. Instead, it honed in on three key sectors: agriculture, energy, and the automotive industry. However, the significance of China's response lies not just in what it targeted, but where it directed its efforts. By focusing on American agricultural exports, China struck at the heart of Trump's political base. Farmers across the Midwest, many of whom rely on exports to China, now face declining sales and economic uncertainty. China's tariffs on energy products hit another critical industry, challenging US dominance in global energy markets. Meanwhile, levies on American automobiles add additional pressure to an already struggling sector. But beyond direct trade retaliation, China has also taken steps to fortify its long-term position in global markets. It has accelerated efforts to secure control over essential supply chains, particularly in the production of rare earth minerals, resources crucial for manufacturing electronics, batteries, and military technology. One of China's most effective countermeasures has been its dominance in the rare earth minerals market. These materials, which include elements such as neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium, are essential for producing high-tech goods ranging from smartphones to electric vehicles and advanced weaponry. China currently supplies the vast majority of the world's rare earths, giving it significant leverage over global supply chains. In response to US tariffs, China has further restricted exports of these materials, forcing American companies to search for alternative sources, a costly and time-consuming process. By controlling access to these critical resources, China is not just retaliating in the short term, it is positioning itself as an indispensable player in the global technology sector, making it increasingly difficult for the US to challenge its economic dominance. Forging new alliances, strengthening ties with US rivals. In addition to controlling key supply chains, China has actively sought to build stronger trade partnerships with countries that rival US influence. Recent negotiations with Russia, Brazil, and key European nations have led to increased cooperation in energy, manufacturing, and infrastructure development. China has also deepened its engagement with nations in Africa and South America, securing long-term agreements for raw materials, food exports, and energy supplies. These moves are designed to create alternative economic pathways, reducing China's reliance on US markets while simultaneously limiting America's global reach. By diversifying its economic relationships, China is making it clear that it will not be cornered by US trade restrictions. Instead, it is actively reshaping international trade networks to minimize the impact of American economic policies. The US-China trade war is no longer just about tariffs and exports. It has evolved into a broader struggle over global economic influence. While the US is using tariffs as a tool to pressure China into changing its trade practices, Beijing is responding with strategic maneuvers that could permanently alter the world's economic landscape. In the short term, these escalating trade tensions will likely lead to increased costs for consumers and businesses in both countries. American companies that rely on Chinese imports for manufacturing face rising production costs, while Chinese exporters must contend with higher barriers to entry in the US market. However, the long-term consequences of this conflict extend far beyond immediate economic disruptions. If China successfully strengthens its control over supply chains, forges new alliances, and reduces dependence on US trade, it could emerge from this dispute in an even stronger global position. For the US, the challenge will be whether its tariffs can genuinely force China to adjust its trade policies, or if they will only accelerate China's efforts to bypass American influence altogether, the hidden weapon, rare earth dominance. While the world fixated on tariffs, China quietly wielded one of its most powerful economic tools, rare earth minerals. These materials, essential for manufacturing everything from smartphones and electric cars to advanced military equipment, play a crucial role in modern technology. China controls over 80% of the global supply of these critical minerals. After the US imposed tariffs, China hinted that it might restrict rare earth exports to the US. This was not just a warning. It was a move designed to hit America where it hurts the most. Imagine trying to build cutting-edge technology without the necessary raw materials. Without access to rare earth minerals, the US tech and defense industries would struggle to keep up with global competitors. Rather than responding with loud threats, China applied quiet but strategic pressure by controlling the resources the world depends on. The message was clear. If the US wanted to challenge China's economic rise, Beijing had the power to fight back in ways that Washington never anticipated. China's retaliation extended beyond agricultural products and raw materials. It also targeted one of America's most lucrative industries, energy. By imposing new taxes on US oil and liquefied natural gas, China disrupted one of the most profitable sectors of the American economy. For years, China had been a top buyer of US energy exports, but after the tariffs, those deals evaporated. The consequences were swift. American energy companies lost valuable contracts, shipments were delayed, and profits plummeted. But China did not simply stop buying energy. It shifted its focus. Beijing accelerated energy agreements with Russia, strengthened ties with Middle Eastern nations, and ramped up domestic production. This move ensured that China would never again be dependent on US energy. Even if tariffs are eventually lifted, these new energy partnerships will likely remain in place, permanently reducing American influence in one of the world's largest markets. A trade war that backfired. While US policymakers attempted to limit China's access to advanced technology by banning the sale of crucial computer chips and preventing companies like Huawei from working with American firms, China responded in a way that few had predicted. Rather than collapsing under these restrictions, China invested heavily in its own technology sector. Beijing poured billions into developing domestic chip manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and next-generation 5G networks. The results? Instead of falling behind, China rapidly closed the gap with US tech giants. Chinese companies are now producing their own advanced chips, building AI systems that rival those in the West, and expanding their influence in global telecommunications. What was meant to be a crippling restriction on China's tech industry may have actually accelerated its rise. The US, in attempting to block China's technological progress, may have inadvertently created an even stronger competitor. This is no longer just a trade conflict. It is a race to determine who will dominate the future of global technology. China's financial leverage, the US debt dilemma. Beyond trade, raw materials, and technology, China has another powerful tool at its disposal: its massive holdings of US government debt. For years, China has been one of the largest foreign buyers of US Treasury bonds, holding over $800 billion in American debt. While selling off these holdings all at once would hurt China's own economy, even small adjustments in its purchasing behavior can send shockwaves through global markets. After the latest round of tariffs, China began quietly reducing its purchases of US debt. This subtle shift made it more expensive for the US government to borrow money, leading to higher interest rates across the economy. The impact was immediate. Borrowing costs for home loans, car loans, and credit cards began to rise, squeezing American consumers and businesses. Without ever making an official declaration, China managed to put financial pressure on the US, demonstrating yet another way it could retaliate without resorting to direct confrontation. The US-China trade war has evolved into something far more complex than simple tariffs. It is now a full-scale economic battle, touching every critical industry, from agriculture and energy to technology and finance. What started as an attempt to pressure China into changing its trade policies has led to a global realignment of economic power. Beijing has successfully minimized its reliance on American goods, secured strategic partnerships with rival nations, and strengthened industries that once depended on US technology. For Washington, the challenge is clear: can the US maintain its economic influence in the face of China's long-term strategy? Or will these moves permanently shift the balance of power? One thing is certain: this is no longer just a trade dispute. It is a geopolitical showdown, one that will shape the future of global economics for decades to come. The US government depends on countries like China to finance its debt by purchasing treasury bonds. When China reduces its investment, even slightly, it makes borrowing more expensive for the US. This move creates financial strains that tariffs alone cannot fix. After the latest round of tariffs, China began quietly buying fewer US bonds. Though this shift went largely unnoticed at first, it had significant consequences. Interest rates on loans, ranging from mortgages to credit cards, began to rise. As the US government faced higher borrowing costs, consumers and businesses felt the impact. This tactic is not an all-out attack, but it is an effective way for China to remind the US that its influence extends beyond just trade. By adjusting its investments, China can destabilize financial markets without making a single public statement. Forging new alliances, China's global trade expansion. While Washington was busy escalating tariffs, Beijing focused on strengthening trade relationships with other major economies. Instead of relying on the US, China expanded its agreements with the European Union, Southeast Asia, Russia, and Latin America. This strategy is about more than just avoiding US tariffs. China is actively building a global trade network that operates outside of American control. The more it strengthens these partnerships, the harder it becomes for the US to leverage economic power against Beijing. For American businesses, this shift presents a significant challenge. Losing Chinese consumers is bad enough, but the real concern is the rise of new competition. As China deepens its trade ties, US companies risk losing their influence in markets where they once held an advantage. The North American shift. Canada and Mexico pivot toward China. While the US and China dominate trade war headlines, Canada and Mexico have been fighting their own battles. Both nations faced US tariffs, which forced them to impose their own countermeasures. Canada targeted American agricultural exports, while Mexico increased taxes on steel, pork, and whiskey. But what happened next is where things took an interesting turn. As tensions grew, both Canada and Mexico began looking for alternative trade partners, and China was ready to step in. With new agreements forming, China strengthened its foothold in North America, weakening US influence in its own backyard. This shift presents long-term consequences. The US has historically relied on strong economic ties with its neighbors, but if Canada and Mexico deepen their relationships with China, Washington's leverage in future trade negotiations will erode. One of the biggest long-term impacts of the trade war has been the transformation of global supply chains. For decades, the US and other countries have relied heavily on China for manufacturing. However, rising tariffs and tensions have forced businesses to reconsider their strategies. China anticipated this shift and acted accordingly. It invested heavily in developing new supply routes in Vietnam, Indonesia, and parts of Africa. By diversifying its production, China reduced its reliance on the US while simultaneously strengthening ties with emerging economies. For American and Canadian companies, this adjustment has brought new challenges. Relocating production is expensive and time-consuming. Higher costs and longer transition periods mean businesses must rethink their entire logistics strategy. This is not just a temporary disruption, it is a fundamental change in how goods are produced and transported worldwide. Even if the trade war subsides, the supply chains of the future will look very different from those of the past. The fallout for American farmers. Few industries have suffered more from the trade war than American agriculture. China was once one of the largest buyers of US farm products, including soybeans, corn, and pork. But after the tariffs, China drastically reduced its purchases, shifting instead to suppliers in Brazil and Argentina. This change left many American farmers with surplus crops, declining prices, and mounting debts. The US government provided bailouts to help farmers stay afloat, but these payments were only a temporary fix. The real concern is what happens in the long run. Once China secures stable suppliers elsewhere, it may not return to US farms. even if tariffs are lifted. This shift could permanently alter American agriculture, leaving many farmers struggling to find new buyers for their products. Beyond the economic consequences, the trade war has also created political pressure. Farming communities hold significant influence in US elections, and their frustration is growing. Many are now demanding a re-evaluation of trade policies, putting additional strain on lawmakers to find a resolution. Trade wars do not just affect businesses, they hit consumers too. Tariffs drive up costs for imported goods, and businesses often pass those costs on to customers. Electronics, clothing, and household items have all become more expensive due to increased import taxes. Smartphones, which rely on Chinese-made components, now cost more than before. Grocery prices have also climbed as tariffs on agricultural imports make food more expensive. Most consumers do not realize how these price hikes are linked to the trade war. Instead, they see rising costs at checkout without understanding the broader economic forces at play. If there is one thing global markets hate, it is uncertainty. And the US-China trade war has created plenty of it. Stock markets have fluctuated wildly as investors struggle to predict the next moves from both governments. Businesses hesitate to make long-term investments, unsure of whether tariffs will increase or decrease. This unpredictability slows economic growth as companies delay expansion plans and consumers cut back on spending. The longer the trade war drags on, the greater the damage to both economies. Trade wars are not just about tariffs. They ripple across industries, disrupt global supply chains, and shake financial markets. Nowhere is this more evident than in the ongoing economic struggle between the United States and China. While Washington has imposed tariffs to curb China's trade dominance, Beijing has responded with long-term strategies to realign global economic power. Each new round of tariffs triggers an immediate response in stock markets. Investors worry not just about higher costs, but about broader implications: how tariffs affect economic growth, corporate profits, and the future of international trade. But this volatility does not just impact Wall Street. It spills over into everyday life, affecting retirement funds, pensions, and personal investments for millions. As financial uncertainty grows, global markets brace for the next unpredictable move in this escalating conflict. The unpredictable nature of tariffs and trade negotiations. Every time the US announces new tariffs or trade discussions break down, stock markets react. Tech giants, automotive manufacturers, and major corporations that depend on global trade see drastic shifts in their stock prices. Investors are not just responding to tariffs, they are reacting to what these trade tensions signal about the future. Markets despise uncertainty, and the US-China trade war has created an abundance of it. When economic policies shift unpredictably, businesses hesitate to expand, hire, or invest. This hesitation slows growth and raises costs, affecting consumers worldwide. While the US and China remain the primary players in this trade war, their battle affects nations across the globe. Countries that rely on trade with both economic giants are caught in the crossfire. Southeast Asian nations, for example, have seen disruptions in supply chains as companies adjust sourcing strategies. European firms that import goods connected to US-China trade are dealing with rising costs. Even developing countries that supply raw materials to China are feeling the pressure as demand fluctuates. This is not just a dispute between two superpowers. The trade war is slowing global economic growth, increasing costs worldwide, and forcing businesses and governments to navigate a new economic landscape. Shifting alliances. China's global strategy. China is not simply retaliating against US tariffs. It is actively reshaping its economic alliances. Instead of relying on American trade, Beijing is forging new agreements with Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. This is not just about avoiding tariffs. China is building an alternative trade network, one where the US has diminished influence. For American businesses, this means more than just losing access to Chinese consumers. It means facing new competition in markets where they once held dominance. Meanwhile, former US allies like Canada and Mexico are rethinking their economic partnerships. Facing their own US-imposed tariffs, both countries have begun strengthening trade ties with China. This shift weakens US influence in North America and forces Washington to reconsider its approach. If China successfully creates a global trade network that bypasses American economic control, the US could find itself with less leverage in future negotiations. The true cost of a trade war: reshaping supply chains. Beyond tariffs and alliances, one of the most significant impacts of this trade war is the transformation of global supply chains. For years, businesses around the world depended on China as the primary hub for manufacturing. However, as trade tensions rise, companies are looking for alternatives. China anticipated this shift and took proactive measures. It has invested heavily in manufacturing hubs in Vietnam, Indonesia, and parts of Africa, creating new supply routes that do not rely on US partnerships. For American and Canadian companies, relocating production is not easy. Higher costs and longer transition periods mean businesses are struggling to adjust. This is not a temporary disruption. It is a permanent shift in how goods are produced and transported worldwide. Even if the trade war ends tomorrow, the supply chains of the future will look very different from those of the past. Few industries have suffered more from this trade war than agriculture. China was one of the largest buyers of American farm products, particularly soybeans, corn, and pork. But after the tariffs, China slashed its agricultural imports from the US, turning to suppliers in Brazil and Argentina instead. For American farmers, this meant a devastating loss of sales, declining prices, and mounting debts. While the US government stepped in with financial aid, bailouts are only a temporary fix. The real concern is long-term. Once China secures reliable suppliers elsewhere, it may not return to US farms, even if tariffs are lifted. This shift presents not just an economic problem, but a political one. Farming communities are critical voting blocs, and their frustration with trade policies is increasing pressure on Washington to find a resolution. The impact of this trade war is not limited to businesses. Everyday consumers are feeling the effects as well. Tariffs on imports drive up costs, and businesses often pass those increases onto their customers. Electronics, clothing, and household goods have all become more expensive as a result. Smartphones, which rely on Chinese-made components, now carry higher price tags. Even grocery prices have risen, as tariffs on agricultural imports make food more expensive. Most consumers do not realize how much of these price hikes stem from the trade war. They see increased costs at the checkout counter without connecting them to global trade disputes. Another critical aspect of this trade war is its impact on financial markets. China holds over $800 billion in US government debt, making it one of America's largest foreign creditors. Although China has not made a drastic move to sell off its holdings, even small adjustments can disrupt global markets. After the latest US tariffs, China quietly reduced its purchases of American debt. This subtle shift made it more expensive for the US to borrow money, leading to higher interest rates across the economy. As borrowing costs rise, everything from home loans to car financing becomes more expensive for American consumers. This financial pressure serves as yet another reminder that China's economic influence extends far beyond trade. Effects on Southeast Asian economies. Southeast Asian countries find themselves in a complex position amid the US-China trade tensions. Nations like Vietnam and Thailand, which have substantial trade surpluses with the US, are at heightened risk due to their deep integration with China's manufacturing supply chains. Vietnam's trade gap with the US has more than tripled, while Thailand's has widened almost five-fold since 2017. This increasing surplus makes them potential targets for US tariffs, compelling these countries to navigate carefully to maintain their economic stability. Chinese companies are increasingly investing in Vietnam to mitigate the impact of US tariffs. Nearly 30% of new projects in Vietnam originate from Chinese firms seeking to circumvent trade barriers. While this influx of investment boosts Vietnam's economy, it also raises concerns about potential US scrutiny over trade practices and the authenticity of product origins. Vietnam's heavy reliance on Chinese raw materials further complicates its position, as it may attract additional attention from the US regarding tariff circumvention. The uncertainty surrounding the trade war has prompted companies to reassess their supply chains and manufacturing strategies. Chinese manufacturers, facing the brunt of US tariffs, are exploring relocation of production to Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia and Thailand to avoid tariff implications. For instance, footwear maker Steve Madden is actively reducing reliance on Chinese manufacturing. This shift underscores the broader trend of companies seeking to diversify their production bases to mitigate risks associated with geopolitical tensions. Vietnam, anticipating potential US tariffs, is considering various measures to mitigate the impact. These include lowering duties on US products, increasing imports of US agricultural goods, and negotiating defense equipment purchases. Additionally, Vietnam is addressing allegations of being a transshipment hub for Chinese goods by imposing anti-dumping duties on Chinese steel. These proactive steps aim to balance trade relations and avoid punitive measures from the US. Investor sentiment and market volatility. Global investors are exhibiting increased caution towards China amid the ongoing trade war. The uncertainty has led to a more conservative approach, with investors avoiding exposure to sectors sensitive to tariffs. This sentiment reflects broader concerns about the stability of global supply chains and the potential for prolonged economic disruptions. Despite these challenges, some analysts argue that the prevailing uncertainty can serve as a catalyst for proactive financial planning. Strategies such as portfolio diversification, maintaining emergency funds, and paying off high-interest debts are advised to navigate the volatile economic landscape. This perspective suggests that while the trade war introduces risks, it also encourages individuals and businesses to adopt more resilient financial practices. The trade war's ramifications extend beyond the US and China, affecting the global economy. Countries that rely on trade with both nations are experiencing supply chain disruptions and increased costs. For example, Southeast Asian countries are encountering challenges in their manufacturing sectors, while European firms face higher expenses when importing goods linked to US-China trade. Developing nations that supply raw materials to China are also impacted as demand fluctuates. This ripple effect underscores the interconnectedness of the global economy and highlights how bilateral trade disputes can have widespread consequences. As the world's two largest economies clash, the uncertainty generated dampens global economic growth, raises costs worldwide, and creates challenges for businesses and governments alike. The uncertainty factor. What comes next? Trade wars are easy to start, but difficult to end. Even if the US and China reach a new trade agreement, the damage has already been done. Business relationships have been strained. Supply chains have been altered. Political trust has been eroded. China has made it clear that it is working to become less dependent on the US. It is investing in domestic industries, strengthening global alliances, and positioning itself as a leader in technology and finance. For the US, the challenge is not just about countering China. It is about maintaining economic influence in a rapidly shifting world. The trade war has revealed that global power is no longer concentrated in one nation's hands. This trade war extends beyond tariffs. It is shaping the future of the global economy. China's actions are not random. They are part of a carefully calculated strategy to realign economic power. The key question remains: who is positioning themselves to lead in the coming decades? Is the US strategy maintaining strength, or is China quietly gaining ground? As tensions continue, the world is watching closely. The decisions made today will determine the economic balance of power for generations to come. One thing is certain, the impact of this trade war will not fade overnight. Its effects will be felt in boardrooms, markets, and households across the world for years to come. Alright, so that's it for this video, and if you want to watch more amazing content like this, check out some of our other videos. Bye!